Good afternoon, everybody. This is another one-take wonder where I am going to talk about a subject that has stressed me out for many a year. Should you spend money? Now, this might sound like a slightly bizarre question, but for some reason, I have always felt there need to be logical structures, frameworks, and at least some level of consideration between almost every decision. And that isn't necessarily because of a moral obligation to do so, although I think perhaps one could make the argument for a considered life being a moral one. I definitely don't think there's a moral obligation to have a logical framework behind everything you do. Rather, my disposition, and perhaps this is just some kind of autism, is such that I can't enjoy doing a lot without that kind of logical backing. So I'd be very interested to see if anyone else has this experience. When it comes to money, it's particularly interesting for me because there are a lot of different competing drives. On the more right-wing side, you have this very visceral and intense desire for consumption and, in the worst instances, showing off, which I really don't like and in fact find demotivating. Some people find that motivating, but for me, sort of showing off, whilst I'm sure on some level it does appeal to an ego, it generally just leaves me feeling worse for wear. I like to do things because I like to do them, not because someone sees it. Which isn't to say there can't be some joy in performance, it's just that I don't like doing things for the sake of, to use the modern vernacular, flexing. So that, fine, I can completely disregard that whole line of inquiry. Then there's a more left-wing idea, which is that consumerism, capitalism, materialism, it's all just a complete scam. And obviously I'm just focusing on the most extreme points, but we'll go into the middle area. And we won't be purely political in this video either. Just this is the two extremes that have first appeared in my mind to discuss. And so on the more left-wing side, there's this idea, as mentioned, capitalism's a complete scam. And I actually think as I've got older, I've become much more sympathetic to this because a lot of the time I've found material purchases quite hollow. And not in the sense that if you've purchase things you should feel bad because it's a hollow, superficial thing to do, but rather I feel hollow and I will buy something and it will just not live up to my expectations. And I think this comes from manufactured wants, and I think this comes from the real downside of capitalism, which the left-wing critique really captures, this idea that people are basically convincing you that you need things when you don't. And I think that is a real problem in our age. And it led to me deciding basically not to buy anything because I bought too many things over the years that I felt weren't worthwhile. And as you get older and you learn more about the economy and money, and not just the importance of capital in, say, an English context where I am, but in a global context, and you see how much money actually affords people, I've become very sensitive to spending it frivolously, at least personally. And so the question of should you spend money, for me, kind of arose from being in that place. From, as a kid, not really thinking too much about money beyond how much is the next Pokemon card I want relative to my allowance. You know, that's essentially my understanding of, that was my understanding of economics. To a point where as I got older and I first had a bit of money, I would spend it and not, really, not necessarily completely frivolously, but I certainly wouldn't think about it to the level I would now. And then got through that period where I learned a bit more about the importance of money, and then got completely scared about capitalism, and then decided I'd never spend anything again. And so I think that kind of progression is actually quite relatable, and I think some people might understand what that's like. And so for me, what I've had to do is come up with a logical framework. Maybe logical framework is even giving it too much credit. it's just a heuristic, really. It's just a way of framing it. And what I've found for me is that capital, at the end of the day, is energy. And it's one of the most powerful forms of energy that there is. It can be transferred into anything, and it can create anything. And that is why capital is important. It has nothing to do with status. It has nothing to do with class. I don't care about any of that whatsoever. It is one thing and one thing only, and that's energy. And that's extremely important. And it's really important to respect money, I think, and understand its power as energy if you're going to try and use your capital wisely. And I think that principle is useful to understand wherever somebody sits on the economic spectrum. If somebody is really poor and they're trying to save up, understanding how certain luxuries that they, whilst they enjoy, is actually expending their capital, thus expending their energy and potentially reducing their ability to leverage their capital to get out of the situation they're in. Just as someone who's a billionaire has to really recognize that if they're spending hundreds of millions on something, that's an inordinate amount of energy. And I also quite like these ways of framing that apply wherever somebody sits on the economic spectrum, because I feel a lot of the ways people frame money and talk about money, it only works in their specific economic context. But I think the understanding of capital as energy, for me, really helps respect it and understand its true importance without getting swept up in a lot of the materialistic nonsense. Another point that's really important is on materialism and on the critique of materialism. I think whilst it's absolutely fair to say there are manufactured wants, and we live in at least if you're in, say, the UK and the US, we live in a situation where there's probably too much emphasis on you need to buy things, you need status, you need certain brands. But a lot of the left-wing criticisms, to me, ignore the fact that even if money didn't exist, even if brands didn't exist, human beings would go around collecting their favourite rocks, their favourite sticks. Children on the beach will find and pick and collect their favourite shells and arrange them in orders and things. You could argue that this is a form of materialism in a very liberal sense, but these are material objects that you're enjoying. And so I think there is actually a desire, and obviously there's a lot of individual variance on this, but there is an actual desire to possess and collect. And some people have the collector bug, some people don't. But generally, possessing objects, even ones that aren't specifically necessary for survival, is quite an innate human desire. The problem is capitalism makes that quite unpleasant, and it can often take the joy out of it, and it can erode the value, and particularly with marketing and with advertising and with these manufactured wants, can create this what feels like a moral obligation, or like a moral imperative to consume. And that's really unpleasant, especially if you're like me and you tend to frame things morally, even if you don't mean to. And so I think this is another thing that's really important to understand when we're answering this question of should you spend money. Recognize that there probably is an actual desire to own things and possess things, even beyond what's needed for survival. If there wasn't, capitalism just wouldn't have ever taken off. Materialism just wouldn't have ever taken off. However, when asking should you spend money, what I do now is I start with the basic framework of capital as energy, so I have to protect it and respect it with that in mind. And then when I'm looking at buying individual items, tell myself there probably is a real desire for this, but relative to how much capital I have at any given point in time, is that cost actually going to improve my life enough to justify it? And that might sound like a very obvious thing that everyone already does, but for me, being able to spell that out was really helpful. And recognizing that, I might want to collect certain things. And for me, what's happened is I really like getting to support artists, and I'm much more likely to buy something less really for the collecting side and more, for instance, a record. I'm much more likely to buy it because it's a living artist who I know this will actually really, really help, especially because a lot of the music I like, they're struggling artists. Not all of them, of course, but the ones that are, I'm particularly keen to support. But then there's another avenue to should you spend money, which I think is really, really worth understanding, and especially if we look at capital as energy. And this is the final point, but it's one of the most important ones for me. It's also been quite liberating. Capital is energy. Energy really is life. But that means if you accrue wealth and save wealth ad infinitum, you're essentially constantly storing energy and never using it. And having that energy behind you is useful, and it gives you freedom and it gives you safety. But if you never use that energy, you're almost wasting that very thing. Now, this isn't to say you should spend all your money right now, but it is to say that if you've become really, really conservative with your wealth and you're getting to a point where you're financially comfortable, there's actually a real argument to say maybe we should expend capital in strategic ways because it can bring you back energy. Now, there's an economic argument for buying things and keeping the economy moving, especially if you're supporting businesses and industries that you really like. And that's another argument in favor of spending some money and not hoarding it religiously. But the core point that I'm making isn't an economic one. It's a personal one. And it's that if capital is energy, that doesn't just mean that materialism has some very interesting components that we need to consider and some interesting consequences that we need to consider, but it means that there's actually a real argument for you spending money on things that leverage that energy effectively. This is a somewhat controversial one. I know they're not always really popular on the internet now, but I've found getting a personal trainer, for instance, which is something that I previously didn't do because I said, well, look, this is just too big a cost. It's not worthwhile. That's completely transformed my life. Another example is therapy. These are all fairly expensive things. They're more expensive than going out to eat once in a while, or even like collecting records, depending on how much you collect records, or whatever it is, or buying Pokemon cards, or buying games, whatever it is. These are fairly expensive things that you don't get anything tangible from. So it's not a transfer of wealth into just another asset. It is in fact completely expending your energy, and then that wealth has disappeared, that capital has disappeared. And yet, they have had a transformative impact on my life. And what I've found is, yes, the capital itself is gone, but the energy has just been transferred into myself, into my health, into my well-being. And so that's where I am now. That's my approach. When I ask myself, should I spend money? Should you spend money? I just start from the beginning and I say, well, what is it? It's energy. So what am I spending it on? Yes, I want to save it. And yes, having that capital behind you and saving is really useful because it gives you energy to use when you need it and gives you freedom. But constantly hoarding it and never expending it, unless of course it's for a specific strategic reason, such as you're trying to buy a house, then expending it in targeted ways at things that give you back your time and contribute to your own energy is in fact one of the greatest things that money can do. And with that in mind, buying things, buying objects, whilst there can be a solid economic argument for it, and there's nothing wrong with it, especially if you're supporting artists and individuals and creatives or whoever it is that you really like, maybe the drive to consume isn't so crucial. Maybe it is a slightly perverted, slightly innate desire. Anyway, this has been a one-take wonder, me rambling off the dome. Let me know in the comments, if you've watched this far, how do you approach spending money? What's your thoughts on it? How do you think about it? I'd be really interested to know. So, thanks for watching, and peace out.